Yeah, looks like social hour has adjourned, so people are filing back in for our final presentation and then final film. Also, playing a song about black and white movies is not the best choice for the movie we're about to see. It is colorful. It is in your face, and Dane will tell you a little more about that. Speaking of Dane, why don't we bring out our final speaker? Hi, I'm so happy to see you. And you know what? I never thanked Molly Martin for introducing you to the Lewis Carroll Society of North America. I was very happy she invited you to one of our screenings and we learned all about you. So thank you, Molly. I assume you're here somewhere. So Dane is an independent filmmaker and YouTuber. He did a series called, was it just Oztober? Sorry.
2021, I did a series called Oztober, where
Yeah.
I looked at 31 Wizard of Oz adaptations on film and television. And most people only know the one film, but I wanted to show the full spectrum over the course of my birthday month, which is October. And then I thought, well, that went well, so I want to do it bigger and better with Alice. And that one seems to have been bigger and better. And so here I am. And I am going to share with you the fruits of my labors. Are we ready?
Yes, Dane watched all these movies, so you don't have to. We are absolutely ready. I will make myself scarce here.
All right. So, hello, boys and girls. I am Dane Keil. I did August in Wonderland in 2022. 31 days, 31 Alice in Wonderland adaptations, a lot of insights, a lot of trends, a lot of interesting things to observe over that fabulous month. And so we're going to just take it one by one. So the funny part about this is that when I was putting this presentation together, the very beginning and the very end are actually not the way I did it in the series, but that's your added value for you. Because we did have that earlier presentation about the history of Alice in Wonderland in film, and you'll see some similar crossover territory here, but I'm going to bring something different to it. Plus, in this very beginning part here, I thought it was just so interesting that so when I did Oztober, I chronicled how L. Frank Baum's Oz books and the dawn of cinema went hand in hand. Well, we kind of have that here with Lewis Carroll, except that we go back even further in time with still photography. And of course, within the realm of still photography, we see that he had his very kind of divided self, his more ordinary public facing self as Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, with the ordinary photography that you see on the right. And of course, he had his fantastical Lewis Carroll brain all the while. So I think it's interesting to note that this emerging medium of film obviously has its origins in still photography, and he was there largely at the dawn of it. But you probably know that already, and you also probably know about his muse, the very precocious Alice Little, who we get a good amount of pictures from. We see that she does not resemble book Alice in any way, but I think her attitude very clearly provided a good template. But I think it's just good to have that as a photographic record as we dive into these first silent film adaptations. Now, I am a huge fan of silent cinema. Um, I will be the first to say that Alice in Wonderland does not really translate that well to silent cinema because it is so built around language. It's something that you kind of need to hear or read or experience in that way. It's not like Oz, where Oz tends to be very action oriented. Now, obviously, we have iconic lines of dialogue and things like that, but for the most part, the silent Oz films, you could watch them fine and you would know what was going on without a lot of words. Alice in Wonderland's a little bit clunkier, but the very first silent adaptations that we got to see, you'll notice that they were, the very first one in 1903 was from the UK, and then the first American one not far after that. So kind of as cinema proper is dawning, so is Alice in Wonderland on film. Now, obviously, these are more like what we would now call a short film just because they are so short. So you can't really tell the full story, just selected highlights. But for what they are, I think they're quite remarkable. And it's a remarkable thing, especially the 1903 one. Remarkable that it still exists in its degraded state, thanks to the BFI for preserving it. But I remember in the earlier presentation, this one, I guess, must not be that highly regarded, and I don't understand why, because I felt like this was one of the strongest ones that I saw, just because it was the only silent adaptation that I saw that was able to tell a good chunk of the story, not all of it. It wasn't able to get to the through the looking glass portions because that part of the film is lost, unfortunately. But the sense of atmosphere of this version is pretty unparalleled. It really shows what silent cinema can do that sound cinema cannot. And the animal costumes I thought were some of the best out of the whole thing. It was really quite remarkable. And the best part, the part that made me laugh when I made the video was the animals. There's a sign that says that they're going to the animal convention. I was like, oh wow, a furry convention 100 years ahead of its time. Imagine that. Um, but yeah, I thought this was a very strong piece. The Cheshire Cat's head in the sky is a very scary image that will not leave you, obviously. Um, but of course, we quickly proceed to the sound versions, which I remembered this version was particularly amusing to me because you could tell that the actors were quite amateur, and it was made outside of the main Hollywood studio system. But within that, you also get some amusing line deliveries, and it has a very creepy atmosphere, and I mean that in a good way. I mean, I think Alice in Wonderland tends to lend itself to horror very easily, and I mean that as a compliment. And I feel like this Alice in particular has a very spaced out, very odd way of delivering her lines. I mean, really everybody in this film, they act like they're mental patients, and that's perhaps appropriate given the subject matter. Best part of this version was when the Duchess was gonna cut Alice's head off with an axe, which, as horrific as the books can be, they didn't quite go that far, and I think that's to the book's detriment because I thought that was a very unsettling scene that could very easily have been on in the background in like a Rob Zombie horror film or something like that. And I remember we were getting another previous presentation was the controversial quote unquote opinion on the 2010 version. Well, guess what? I have a controversial opinion on this version, which is I don't think it's that good. I really don't. I think it's got a lot of great things about it, but what kills it is that the storytelling is just so jumbled. The whole thing is not that the storyline of Alice in Wonderland needs to be told in an exact sequence because it doesn't follow conventional plot structure, but it does tend to have a build up to meeting a monarch or some kind of larger goal. But the events from both books are pretty scattershot. They're just kind of thrown around willy nilly. Now, it does have some impressive effects for the time, but it created an unnecessary uphill battle that Snow White and the Seven Dwarves and then eventually the Wizard of Oz would have to overcome, and they did, thankfully. But this should have been the classic 1930s Alice in Wonderland adaptation that it was destined to be. But unfortunately, it just wasn't there because the performances aren't there. They're very dull and lifeless. And Alice in this version is kind of sleepwalking her way through it. And it just doesn't really understand the irony of the story, I don't think either. But it does have some impressive creature costumes in particular. Probably the best mock turtle that I've ever seen, although you would never know that it was Cary Grant in there unless they told you, which they had to in the opening credits, despite how star-studded it was. But then, of course, the movie that we just watched, the 1949 version, I thought was a hidden gem. It started talking about trends in these adaptations. One of the key things that I tried to do in covering a whole month of adaptations, part of the goal was to see how this public domain story, how it changed and evolved, and how different insights were gleaned from it as the world changed, as different countries interpreted it, and that kind of stuff. So it was meant to not just be so much about how any one adaptation was in and of itself, but how they all fit together. And in this case, you do see a couple trends emerge. One is that the French have an interesting relationship with the text, despite it being about as English could be. But also the fact that this begins the trend of Alice being noticeably aged up from how she is in the book and also resembling her book counterpart in real life as well as in Wonderland, because the other trend is that Lewis Carroll himself becomes a character, and not the first time that that will be done. And I believe that out of all the ones I looked at, this was when it first started to appear. But you run into weird trends, which is that, again, Alice resembles her book counterpart, as we saw. Or the real Alice Little looked nothing like her book counterpart. And I don't have a photo of that particular version of Lewis Carroll, but he doesn't resemble the real Lewis Carroll. If anything, the actor that they chose for this one looks a bit like Abraham Lincoln to me. So yeah, that's kind of a weird casting choice, but you do see an early emergence of the French feeling like they have something to say with this story, and also the brilliant fusion of live action with stop motion, as we saw. To me, it was on par with what would later be done in something like The Nightmare Before Christmas, although that was several decades later, and yet the smoothness of the animation is being shown off quite remarkably that early on. But then, of course, you run into weird things like this, which this is, I have a copy of the movie on DVD, and this is the cover. It's like, there is no doll in the movie. It does not spank Alice or some other girl that vaguely resembles her, and it's not the porno version, or one of them. There's more than one, which we'll get to the most famous one. But it's like, really, what were they thinking? I have no clue where this emerged from. Makes me laugh every time. It's surprisingly common. So if anybody has an answer as to where that came from, let me know, because it makes you think it's something different. I'll just put it that way. But of course, the ones that many of us hold near and dear to our hearts is Disney's many attempts to try to bring the story to life, which was better chronicled in the previous presentation. But I think we also see an example of another trend, which is the tendency for not just appropriations of certain aspects of the Alice story, but one in which the very basic concept of a girl whose name may or may not be Alice going to a land that is fantastical, where it has only the barest, most tangential relationship to the story. And that's what we see here, which really, the first of the Alice comedies was more of like a proof of concept for Laugh-O-Gram Studios, and yet it helped to create what was ostensibly one of the first Disney franchises, if we can call it that. But again, its ties to the actual text are tangential at best. But laid the groundwork for many great Disney films yet to come, including the version that many of us know and love. And another trend that you notice with this particular version, because this version got criticized at the time, and by some circles of people today, got criticized a little bit for being too Americanized, and it's a little too arguably cartoony in terms of the antics. It's more about how much zaniness can we put on the screen, as opposed to the nuances of the language. But I think, honestly, that was a wise decision, just because even Walt Disney knew that it might be difficult to translate to the screen, and so some of the adjustments he made were to take the narrative and to give it a little bit more structure, whittle it down just a bit, make it to where Alice is the one on trial and not the knave or anything like that. And I feel like in doing that, he was able to streamline it and make the story arguably more about something, which is not to say that the book is not, because obviously it is, but it's one of those things that fits a cinematic structure much greater than other versions were able to do. And of course, the songs are extremely memorable. The narrative, although it is simplified, I think the themes are made very clear, and they were able to take all these seemingly random events and make them into a more or less cohesive narrative. But of course, it took many decades for this particular version to be recognized as the masterpiece that I think it is, and it holds a special place in people's hearts. And plus, I think that this particular version of Alice is probably the best ever put to film, just because she has that right blend of being proactive and intelligent and curious, but also not just sitting back and allowing these things to happen to her without her protesting a bit. So she hits that bullseye perfectly. But then things start to go awry, a little bit awry here, and when you hit the 60s and 70s, you start to notice the world changing a bit, and you see that we get off the beaten track a little bit, off the bullseye. And I'm a little surprised we didn't mention this film in our history of Alice films, because this film is quite possibly the worst thing made by anyone ever. It I go on a rant about it in the video that I made about it, but it was not about Alice. It was about another beloved children's character, Madeline, who, no offense to Madeline, but she does not hold a candle to Alice, by a long shot. Alice gets sidelined in favor of Madeline and a bunch of other random children's book, short pieces that get strung together into a feature. And it was made in the Czech Republic by American filmmakers, and yet it's set in Paris. It's about Paris, and Alice is just there. And more than that, they just sideline her by saying, the very beginning of the movie is, Wonderland sure was remarkable, wasn't it, Dinah? But Madeline lives in Paris. That's a Wonderland that's real. And I'm like, wow, just way to absolutely take one of the greatest fantasy protagonists ever and just throw her under the bus. It is unreal, the gall that they had. And it's also badly animated. It has nothing to do with the story. And it's one of those ones that I watch so you don't have to. And that's another category that we have here, are the ones that I watch so you didn't have to. But yeah, this one is just simply, it's one of the worst animated films I've ever seen, in fact. But that's, of course, punctuated by really good adaptations. And one thing you could say about the 1933 version was that, despite the fact that it didn't quite come together in the wash like they wanted it to, it was quite star-studded with a lot of really heavy hitters for 1930s Hollywood. And of course, another trend that emerges is the star-studded adaptation with whatever stars are big in whatever country or time period. And of course, the 72 version, I think, is held in very similarly high esteem, especially in the UK, in its native country, because of the talent that's on screen. We mentioned Peter Sellers. And of course, I think Fiona Fullerton, I think, is one of the best Alice's that was ever done in live action, even though she also is aged up relative to what the character's supposed to be. She also resembles her book counterpart when she shouldn't be. And also, Lewis Carroll as a character is in there. So we're continuing that trend. But that particular adaptation does not really reinvent the wheel when it comes to narrative, but it's just solid, straightforward. You could do a lot worse than that one. Plus, the effects are actually some of the best in terms of being practical and having aged well. There's a lot of forced perspective shots when they make Alice grow and shrink, and so those age a lot better than the film that we're going to be watching later on. But then we get to adult Alice, which is always fun, which I think that it's one of those things where, as you're watching these back to back, you kind of wonder to yourself, could an adult version of this story, how good could it possibly be? And especially relative to all these other ones that you're watching. And guess what? The 76 version is actually one of the best that I watched during the entire lineup. It's a really funny, fun movie with really great music. And, it's not as strictly adhered. It doesn't adhere to this text as much as one would want, but it still manages to take the text and be a really fun movie. And of course, yes, it is pornographic, but there are, versions of it that there's an R-rated version that cuts out a lot of the hardcore scenes, and that way it could play at different levels of theaters. You know, you'd have one version for the adult theater and the other version for more mainstream theaters. And, you know, by the time we hit the 70s, and that's where you start to introduce a lot of fiction that had themes of, you know, self-discovery and discovering meaning through experience, that kind of stuff. And in the video, I brought up Pippin and Hair and other stage musicals of the time that tended to cover those themes as well. But yeah, this one is a lot better than one would think it would be. It is kind of a diamond in the rough, I think, if you can handle it. But the jokes are really funny. I was genuinely impressed. And fun fact, to this day, my review of this version is the most viewed video out of all of them. It just hit 5,000, which I wonder why. But kind of keeping with that similar theme, this is one that I'm not sure a lot of people know about, but it's again, another French version. And this one is, I described it when I made the video, I described it as Alice in Wonderland kind of in reverse, where it's instead of a little girl challenging social proprieties and structures as she will inevitably grow up and be expected to be a part of that social milieu. It's a older woman who is being forced into domesticity against her will and having to deal with that. There's a lot more to it than that. It's a very deliberately ambiguous narrative, but it is a very good thematic continuation and a very good thematic reversal of Alice in Wonderland in many ways. And it is just a good French kind of art house erotic, a piece of French art house erotic cinema. If you're into that sort of thing, it's not necessarily something that you'd put on for the family on a Saturday night, I wouldn't think. But if you when I watched it, it put me right back into college when I watched things like Belle de Jour and things like that. I liked, you know, French art house cinema. And another one that is a bit tangential, but does a lot with a little, is Terry Gilliam's Jabberwocky, which the actual Jabberwocky poem in Through the Looking Glass is quite short, so to make a feature-length adaptation out of it was quite the monumental task, but I feel like they pulled it off remarkably well, and it's quite accessible to people who don't even know that the Jabberwocky poem is from Through the Looking Glass. And another theme that I noticed when I was putting together the videos was that I said in quite a lot of them there was a difference between good movie and good adaptation. And the ideal, of course, is that you want to have both if you can. Sometimes you have one or the other. This is an example of perhaps not the greatest adaptation, or at least a very vastly overinflated one. You know, or one that has to be greatly expanded upon relative to what he had to work with. But, you know, it is, I think, a very strong movie. It was made during Terry Gilliam's transition period from Monty Python to his solo directorial career, and it has all of his trademarks. And it's just, to me, it's impressive that he was able to get so much out of what's a very short poem and make it funny and have that good blend of satire and fantasy and horror and stuff like that. And of course, the actual Jabberwocky does not disappoint when it finally emerges. So yeah, that was a particular highlight for me. And of course, you know, I had got to fight my own Jabberwocky in the video, so you know, that was a fun time. But then of course we touched briefly upon the Soviet Union adaptations, which, if you've never watched them, you really owe it to yourself to watch them, because not only is the animation fantastic, it's really trippy animation. It kind of reminded me of Yellow Submarine or something like that. But it's really interesting whenever, because this was very much during Iron Curtain days and that kind of stuff. So importations of things from the West would have been, you know, heavily monitored and regulated and that kind of stuff. But in the midst of all that, you did have like a version of Winnie the Pooh that was supposed to be pretty good, which I've never watched, but the animation is vastly different from Disney. And of course, the same thing here. Animation is vastly different from Disney. And it covers off most of the main story beats, but again, another trend is the idea of countries that are decidedly not English or English speaking that are able to take this story and do their own thing with it while still being largely faithful to the text. They aren't the greatest adaptations in terms of the scripts just because they are relatively short, but you really do owe it to yourself to watch them just because the animation is so vastly different from what we're used to in the West, and it will really expand your mind, which I know is kind of what that's why we love Alice in Wonderland so much. Then, of course, there's a lot of them from the 80s. That's something that I observed. I mean, there's a lot from many decades and countries and that kind of stuff, but the 80s seem to be the decade of the more family-friendly television adaptations, at least in America. There's a ton of them. And the 85 version, this was another star-studded adaptation that we saw. 30s one, we saw 70s for British talent. Now we're seeing an 80s American, well, film and television talentscape, some of whom are not in their prime, then some of whom are up and coming. Like there was a young John Stamos pre Full Houses in this one, but of course you got like Carol Channing and Lloyd Bridges and Sammy Davis Jr. and just it's teaming with talent. Pat Morita is in there, and I think this one's an interesting one also because you see with these adaptations how there are some that skew on one end of the spectrum or another in terms of darkness and complexity versus being more child friendly and more not so much simplistic but more inviting, more colorful, less threatening, less creepy, or any kind of darker implications. And this one skews more on the end of being a very family friendly adaptation. This one is one that I think you could have easily shown the family on CBS in 1985, which is when it aired over 2 nights. It's geared towards an American audience in terms of who all is in it. They don't really try to make it English in any way. If any, like this is probably the most Americanized version that I saw. But in terms of checking off a lot of the storytelling boxes and covering most of the events, it does quite a good job of it. It's just so long because the adding both parts together, it's 3 hours long. And I really like this version of Alice. I think it was Natalie Gregory was her name, and liked her a lot because she reacts to things like a child would react to them, and she's also the correct age to play Alice too, even though her hair is actually a wig, and it's the hair looks exactly the same as the wig that I don't think it was. No, that was her real hair for it was Carol Ann in Poltergeist. She looks exactly the same. I was like, is that Heather O'Rourke? Heather O'Rourke? No, it's not, But yeah, you could argue that this adaptation, because it's more family friendly, you could argue that it's possibly not dark enough, but that's kind of up to debate. And then, of course, the ultimate example of good movie does not equal good adaptation does not equal good movie is the 86 version made by the BBC. In terms of strict text fidelity, this is probably the best adaptation that I watched. But in terms of an actual viewing experience, I thought it was one of the weakest ones, just because it so adheres to the text that it feels very stilted. And plus, the BBC programming, the budgets must have been really small at the time because they want to do so much more than what they're realistically able to do. And the blue screen compositing effects are really not good, although we're going to see examples of some not so good blue screen compositing effects in just a few minutes. But despite it being from the BBC, it's like the acting's surprisingly not very good. Kate Dorning's one of the weakest Alices that I've seen, even though I think she's an adult trying to play a child. And again, we have that trend of introducing Lewis Carroll as a character and Alice Little as a character, although that version of Alice Little actually kind of sort of looks like the real person, even though she's way too old. But I give credit where credit is due. But yeah, this to me is the ultimate example of good adaptation does not equal good movie, at least to me. Although, and it's long, it does check off a lot of the storytelling boxes. It feels like a chore to get through. And of course, the adaptation that we all know and love this one, don't we? We can practically recite the dialogue in our sleep, can't we? When I made the video, I was like, what do you want me to say? It's the Care Bears. I mean, did you honestly expect it to be good? Yeah, didn't think so. I mean, and I'm not really like a Care Bears enthusiast. I'm not, I was too young for it. And or I wasn't born during the heyday of it, and then by the time I would have been the right age, I never encountered it. But it's like, it's from what I've looked into, it's like this one's bad by Care Bears standards, which is saying a lot. And of course, has virtually nothing to do with the story. It's very tangential, very arbitrary as to why they picked Alice in Wonderland, other than that it's a public domain property. And of course, the biggest insult is that Alice's main conflict is that she's, quote, not special. And I'm like, wow, get some real problems, why don't you? But yeah, animation wise, surprisingly, there are worse ones out there. Like it's not, Disney quality or like the USSR version, but it's one of those things that you could surprisingly do worse. Although the one reason why you do want to watch this version is for this face. Yes. It appears for like a fraction of a second for like a single frame, and I made that the thumbnail because I was like, that's too perfect. But yeah, I was like, this cutesy, so inoffensive, you can't believe it, adaptation has that face in it, and I'm like, yes. But then, of course, as I mentioned, there are worse adaptations and worse animated versions that are out there. There you go. And it would be this 87 version of Alice Through the Looking Glass, animated even worse. An adaptation that would have surely been rejected by whatever Saturday morning cartoon block they would have tried to sell it to as like an original movie or something like that. Some of the worst animation, not as bad as Alice of Wonderland in Paris, but still quite bad. The songs are some of the worst. The target audience would have surely switched off and switched over to G.I. Joe or something else that would have been on at the time if it had aired. And the weirdest thing about this one is, another trend that I observed is when they have to add characters that they shouldn't have to add because there are plenty of characters to choose from. And this one has a magician who looks like a jester, and he's like Alice's main guide through Looking Glass Land is what they call it. And I'm like, why did you have to make up a character? There were plenty to choose from, but surprisingly that happens a few times, not as much as you'd think. It happens more times with the ones that are more tangential, but the ones that stick closer to the actual text, they don't have to do that as much, although we'll get to a few that do have to do that. And yeah, this version of Alice, again, we've got American Alice, which I'm never a fan of, and she wears like these jeans, and I'm like, wow, we're getting like way off we're getting way off base here, aren't we? And then of course, these are some of my favorites out of the whole lineup. Because as I mentioned before, Alice in Wonderland tends to waver between ones that are more child friendly versus ones that are not. And because there are a lot of dark elements to the story that need to be talked about in certain adaptations. And I think some of the ones that I'm going to talk about just now, I think that they did it very well. And of course, Dreamchild's one of the more controversial picks, I think, but it was one that I had not seen before, and it was besides the 51 Disney version that we all know and love, this was probably the best one that I watched out of the whole lineup, just because it was the perfect blend of serious drama with fantasy and with impressive practical effects from the Jim Henson Creature Shop. And finally, we have an Alice that looks like Alice Little. And of course, it is predominantly Alice Little rather than the character Alice, but still, it's just nice to see this fantastical world realized with someone who looks more like the real person. And I just loved I thought the script was really delicately layered. I like the ways in which it blends fantasy and reality and the intersections of memory and fantasy in order to achieve a greater insight into one's past. It's one of those movies that I feel like it's a crime that it's not better known and that there aren't more movies like it. The closest I could think of would be someone like Guillermo del Toro doing Pan's Labyrinth. That really was the closest I can think of, but yeah, it's just an expertly written film. I do agree with some of the people that I saw in the chat earlier that were saying that the love story with the journalist is largely unnecessary, and I would actually agree with that because I think the main drama is strong enough to carry it through. And really like that the puppets in this version, that the way that they look possibly the closest to the actual John Tenniel illustrations, and they show off just how creepy those characters really would be in 3 dimensions. Because even the Disney version, that those characters, yeah, they were kind of Disneyfied and they had their inviting aspects to them, but when they needed to get mad or creepy, they could do it. But then these are more like straight translations, and you're like, yeah, the Mad Hatter is very creepy looking, and the March Hare does have gross teeth and that kind of stuff. And it's just, I not everyone's gonna agree, but I thought it was quite the masterpiece of fantasy drama storytelling. And of course, Jan Svankmeyer's stop motion masterpiece. I think I saw clips of this when I was in college, but it was really good to revisit it and to be able to watch the whole thing and bring it to everyone. I kind of called it Eraserhead for kids. You know, that's kind of how I thought of it in my head. Easily one of the most disturbing movies I've ever seen, and probably the most disturbing non R-rated, non horror film that I've ever seen. Like, you could show this to a kid in terms of content, like there's no bad language or gore or anything, but it's like, would you want to? I don't think you're winning Parent of the Year for that one. But what I love about this version is that this one dives into kind of a darker interpretation of the story in a different way, because it is able to talk about how the adults in Wonderland are quite abusive to Alice, like verbally abusive. They're yelling at her or trying to kill her. And this one doesn't shy away from that, up to and including Wonderland quite literally being underground in a basement. And there's a lot of themes of possible neglect and things preserved in jars and things like that. It's really, really eerie. It's creepy, and it also illuminates another angle on the story, which is that possibly Alice is not being taken care of by her parents or by the adults in Wonderland, whether they're literal or metaphorical, which I'm sure was all too common in Victorian society at the time. But it really does strip the story down to its essence, and it's able to show it off in all of its kind of grimness, if you choose to go that route. And that's the nice thing about this story, is that it's able to sustain a lot of different interpretations. Odd thing to notice about this one is that I don't think the Cheshire Cat's in it at all, which is a really odd omission, but I don't really know where else he would have fit, because the creepiest character in this one is easily the White Rabbit, who's scarier than any slasher villain I ever saw. And then, of course, I'm kind of going out of chronological order for this one, but I was like, I don't know where else to put it. We covered the version of the Disney version that never made it, that would have been a lot darker, but we didn't cover Marilyn Manson's attempt at a directorial debut that would have presumably, quote unquote, been about the life of Lewis Carroll kind of through his own lens, but really it would have just been about him ostensibly, and it would have been probably part avant-garde music video and part horror film. You know, that was kind of what it was hyped to be. but it never made it past a proof of concept trailer. And that was all I had to talk about. It's one of those greatest films never made. And it does touch upon the Phantasmagoria poem that we covered at the beginning of the evening, or it would not have been the evening at that time, but yeah, it covers off Phantasmagoria, has some allusions to Alice in Wonderland. The actual teaser trailer is quite disturbing if you ever watch it, but it's one of those things where if you like the horror genre, part of me really wishes that it would have actually seen the light of day, but relative to recent events, perhaps that's for the best that it never happened. And then it is rather odd that in the late 90s, there was like this brief glimmer of the adaptations that were faithful, that attempted to be faithful. Because we kind of got off track there in the 80s. We had a few that were more on point, and then we had some other ones that were getting way off base. And then now we circle back around just as the millennium is ending. And what I found interesting with this particular version, which I remember we watched it when I was on one of these the last time, it is the only really faithful version of Through the Looking Glass, which that book does not tend to get adapted as a solo work. Usually a select few characters appear in an Alice in Wonderland adaptation. So you'll get Tweedledee and Tweedledum, you might get the White Knight, you might get the Jabberwocky, but very few of them actually just do that book. And I framed in the video, I framed this one around the kind of late 60s nostalgia trip that was going on in the culture at the time. And it's very true because the actual filmmaking, it has a lot of homages to psychedelic films from the late 60s, early 70s in terms of the jump cuts, in terms of the montages. But in terms of the aged up Alice, this one's easily the most egregious example because I think Kate Beckinsale was 25 at the time, and she's supposed to play a mother who is reading the story and then she goes into the story. And I'm like, okay, we're not even trying now, are we? We're not even trying to have like an actual little girl in this thing. Not that we tried all that hard to begin with, but most of them have been teenagers in these adaptations. But yeah, I'm like, when are we gonna have like Alice in a walker? That's what I want to know. But yeah, it's probably the only like truly faithful version of the story that I can recall. And obviously we mentioned the wasp in the wig incident, that it's the only time you'll ever see that get adapted in a form outside of the original book. In terms of live action adaptations, I feel like this 1999 one was the one where all the elements came together just right, because of the sequence of events being right. They have a couple of elements from Through the Looking Glass in there, not too many. Alice is an appropriate age, and one of the very, very few Americans who could do a convincing, more or less convincing British accent in one of these adaptations. And the framing device, that's another thing I didn't point out earlier, was that when it comes to these adaptations, there tends to be a need for a framing device to try to have the narrative arc in a way that's appealing for film, because the original books, their structure is not at all 3-act storytelling structure. And the ones that we've seen before, they've tended to need a framing device. Oftentimes it's an invention of the screenwriter. And this one's not that earth-shattering with her being nervous for her dance recital, but you'd be surprised at how well it integrates into the narrative. And of course, another star-studded cast for late 90s stars like Whoopi Goldberg and Christopher Lloyd, and Martin Short is probably the best live-action Mad Hatter that has ever been. I mean, because he looks like the Mad Hatter anyway, and they get his head to be way bigger than his body, and it just looks perfect outside of like the puppet versions that I mentioned before. And it's kind of heartbreaking that it is the last version that really attempted to be faithful to the original text, as far as I'm aware of, at least in the popular consciousness. I'm sure that others will eventually arise, but as far as a big, well-known version. This was kind of it. But it is a beloved one, and I think it probably is the best overall combination of elements, and the effects surprisingly are pretty darn good even to this day. Because a lot of these effects don't really age very well, but these ones did. And then, of course, we get to the Millennium adaptations, which tended to all be unofficial sequels, spin-offs, reboots, reimaginings, this, that, because, we have a hard time with original ideas. But occasionally, you do get some hidden gems, and kind of in the same theme as Dream Child, but not about real people. Just the idea of a fantasy drama. We have this underrated gem, Phoebe in Wonderland, which again, very criminal omission from the canon of Alice adaptations, I think, because it shows the power of storytelling and what it can mean with a person, which we saw a couple speakers ago. We saw the impact that the 2010 version had on her life. And this is an example of how the school in this film, it's a girl who I think it has OCD or some other, they never say explicitly what she has, but she is able to put herself into an Alice in Wonderland adaptation on the stage, and she's able to find some stability and purpose. And young Elle Fanning is in here, and she has she does a wonderful performance, and you see just what great potential she showed even then. And yeah, it's a really, it can be kind of hard to watch in some places, but it's well worth it. I'm just kind of sad that it, again, not very well known, only on DVD, and probably you can find it, you can purchase it online somewhere, the digital version of it, but yeah, not as well known as it deserves to be. Definitely recommend it if you never heard of it. The 2009 miniseries, I was really looking forward to this one. I was very disappointed because it was made, the director was the same one who did Tin Man, which I really loved. That was the steampunk version of The Wizard of Oz that came out in 2007, which I watched live. I watched it when it first aired. I was really looking forward to this one, and guess what? It didn't come together. I thought the effects were surprisingly kind of bad. But it just kind of shows that certain stories just don't translate to dystopian sci-fi very well. And I wanted to do an episode on The Matrix, but when I watched I watched the whole series, and I was like, there's only just a few select homages. It's not strong enough to be a full adaptation. But this one tried to ride the Matrix's coattails a little bit, and didn't quite pull it off. I think it didn't really quite know what it wanted to be, but found it refreshing that that this one was able to cover an Alice that was old enough to think about issues of like love and marriage. And we actually get to dive into Alice's father, who you never really think about outside of this version and the Tim Burton version. Oh, yeah, and by the way, this version and the Tim Burton version have a surprising amount in common because of the emphasis on Alice's father. They both have the line, "the Alice," and also the idea that there was an older Alice that had come to Wonderland before, and she has to fulfill the prophecy, which 10 billion prophecy narratives, we don't need anymore. But I was like, were they thinking along incredibly similar lines or what? Because there's a lot of parallels. I was really surprised. Um, this is an underrated one, the Malice in Wonderland. Kind of like if you mushed a Guy Ritchie movie and a David Lynch movie together. Um, and it's really neat to think about the story through kind of a weird psychedelic crime lens. It's not for everyone. Elements don't come together quite as well as you might hope, but one of my favorite movies when I did Oztober was I watched a movie called Oz, a Rock and Roll Road Movie, and that one took the story and it kind of stripped it down without any magical elements and just made it a rock and roll road movie. And this kind of reminded me of that in the sense that it was a kind of small time crime movie um, with a psychedelic lens. But yes, this is real. Alice in Murderland. This is one of those I watched it so you don't have to types of movies. A zero budget slasher film that uses the Alice characters and iconography as just the barest of bones, the most tangential of window dressing for this thing. If you like So Bad It's Good movies, this is one that you definitely gotta watch. You can find it online very easily for free. And what's stuck out to me about this one was that so we watched I watched the actual porno version from 1976, which was a legitimately great movie, even without anything hardcore happening in it. This one was weird in the sense that it felt like a porno, but with the sex scenes cut out. And I was like, because you think about it and you're like, without any of these scenes in this film, it's like you're just left with bad acting and awkward lines of dialogue, awkward scenarios, and that's what it feels like. It's hard to describe unless you've seen it, but again, if you're a connoisseur of crap, it's a good one to check out if you're in the mood for that sort of thing. But don't be expecting a good adaptation because it uses the costumes and the names as like just the absolute bare bones of anything. And case in point, the picture I chose to use, they say in the piece, they say, "Aren't you supposed to be the White Rabbit?" "Yes, but I find black to be much more flattering." And they were all out of White Rabbit costumes, and I just roll my eyes, like, you're not even trying. And then of course, the Tim Burton version. Oh, the controversy. I too have a little bit of nostalgia for this one because I saw it when I was at downtown Disney when my family went to Disney World, and I too did not expect much from this movie, and I was pleasantly surprised with it. Now in the video I made of it, I did pick it apart a bunch because there is a lot to pick apart. If anything, like if I'm just being purely objective, I should hate it just because it has the trope of the prophecy narrative. It has it's a very formulaic hero's journey movie when Alice in Wonderland was nothing of the sort. It has a lot of things about it that you could easily pick apart, and yet, despite the fact that the source material does not lend itself to a hero's journey narrative that easily, the end result hangs together a lot better than you might think that it would. And it is one of Tim Burton's better later period works, which isn't really saying much, but I think Mia Wasikowska was a surprisingly strong Alice, one of the better teenaged Alices that we have seen, and surprisingly a pretty convincing version of what one could presumably think a teenaged Alice might be like, or a young woman Alice might be like. And they kind of were able to have their cake and eat it too a little bit, in the sense that they build it as a kind of unofficial sequel to the original narrative. And so that's how they were able to continue it, even though it's just called Alice in Wonderland. So, it's a little bit deceptive, but it's not quite as deceptive as you might think. But I don't blame people who don't like it. But yeah, this is one where you get into the extravaganzas that we're seeing now. This one kind of kicked off the Disney trend of remaking their animated canon. Although this one, you have, whether you love it or hate it, you have to admit it is not the same movie as the 1951 version, which is what they would end up doing later. And later they would just do the live action carbon copies of their animated canon. And then we come to the 2016 version of Alice Through the Looking Glass, which that's probably the rantiest I ever got in any of the videos I made, which I will spare you the worst of it here. You have to watch the video for yourself if you want to hear me scream at the camera. But the crux of it to me is that not only does it have nothing to do with the book, to me it felt like they had a script for H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, like a new version of that. It feels like they had a script for that laying around, and then they realized, oh wait, we had that profitable movie once, 6 years ago. Let's dust it off. Let's change some characters around, and boom, it'll have more more commercial appeal. And of course, it backfired miserably, because as profitable as the Tim Burton version was, this one bombed pretty cataclysmically. It's not without its good parts, because again, Mia Wasikowska, I think, her performance is actually better in this one, just because she gets to play an Alice who's even more mature and has more experience with the world. And she's able to give a wider range of emotion, which is nice, because she was a little bit flat in the Tim Burton version because she was a more repressed person. But the failure of this movie, and just how cataclysmically wrong of a calculation it was, it basically killed Alice in Wonderland on the big screen, as far as the conceivable future is concerned. We could be seeing something new at some point, but yeah, Alice has kind of been dormant in the mainstream for quite a while, which does necessitate a question as to what the future holds for Alice. We do have some signs of what's to come. This is one that I could not get to when I did my analysis of the 31 versions. And I didn't cover it. I did watch it, but I didn't cover it because it actually had more to do with Peter Pan than it did with Alice in Wonderland. But it's an interesting movie because it does fuse Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland together, and it gives us our first I was gonna say African American, but they're British in the story, so I guess it'd be I forget what the term is, but you get my point. Non-white Alice, which is surprisingly it's the only one I can think of that did that. We've had versions of Dorothy that were that way, quite a few of them, but we have not really had one of Alice up until this movie, as far as I know. A little surprising that it took us this long. It's worth seeing, but don't expect strict fidelity to the text, because it is its own thing. And it flew under the radar because it came out during the pandemic, so obviously whatever chances it would have had to be seen were kind of quashed as a result. But if you can find it, it's an interesting one to check out. And then of course you will see Alice pop up every now and again. Like there's that new Disney Plus show. I think it was Wonderland Kitchen, or forget what it's called, but one of those kind of Disney Junior shows, meant for a really young audience. And Alice and the characters do live on in certain tangential places, like Once Upon a Time. And I didn't cover any of like the Asylum movies. Like there's one Avengers Grimm, and then there's one Sinister Squad, which rips off Suicide Squad, and the Queen of Hearts is in that one. It's so you will find random characters pop up in unexpected places, but Alice is still seen as an important IP for Disney and still is an iconic character. But as far as strict adaptations, we have been due for one for a while, and I'm really wondering if we will get it. The task may have to be in the hands of independent filmmakers. Gee, like who? Like me. Because in August in Wonderland, in between each review, I did have a little storyline segment to kind of tie the whole thing together. And there is a climax towards the end of the series. And so I got to have my own Alice, which is, I think, what all of us who are creatively inclined, if we love these characters and they are in the public domain, it is up to us to keep them alive, because that is how we ensure the longevity of the source materials, by continually reintroducing it in new ways to new generations, in new languages in other parts of the world. If I do bring the series back, I'll want to cover some of the more obscure ones, and some of the ones that are outside of the English-speaking world, especially the anime. There's a ton of anime that I didn't even get to. I want to cover some of the main ones, but it is up to us. It is up to us to always keep the flames burning in the midst of time passing. That's why I have done the series that I've done, to try to hopefully encourage the next generation, and encourage the next generation of people that are literarily adept and are aware of just what powerful stories these are. Now, if you have not seen the series, which I'm guessing is most of you, the full series is on my YouTube channel, which is listed below. It's Dangerous Arts, and I have the full series playlist listed here. And I could always send out copies of the slides if anyone was interested, but it should be easy to find. And there is a certain adaptation that I left out of that lineup, one that I didn't know about until relatively recently. And as a little capper to this presentation, I thought I would show it to all of you. So this is an exclusive, brand new review in the style of the series, and it's about the movie that we will watch after I'm done with this. And it is my review for all of you of the 1970 version of Alice in Wonderland. So I'll let myself take it away. Hello, boys and girls of the Lewis Carroll Society of North America. So good to see all of you. Thank you so much for your support of my August in Wonderland series. It really means a lot that all of you seem to have, for those of you who watched it. Now, as a capper to my little presentation here, I was asked to look at the 1970 French adaptation that apparently not a lot of people had heard of, including me, I have to say. I had not included it in my lineup because I never heard of it, but it's from the 70s, it's in French, and I'm sure it's going to be wondrous and fantastical because it's Alice in Wonderland. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Oh, did I just watch a movie or did I just have a complete and utter freak out? I mean, okay, so describing this movie is like warfare, okay? It's like vast stretches of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. You did this on purpose to me, didn't you? You wanted to watch me suffer. Well, guess what? If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. So strap in, bitches. This is Alice in Wonderland 1970. So where do I even start reviewing this thing? Normally, this is where I give you some background information on the film, such as its place in film history, historical context, all that good stuff. But guess what? There's barely any information about this film online. IMDb says nothing about it other than the fact that it exists. Yeah, thanks for nothing, you incompetent, mentally deficient bizwhackers.
Bizwhack, something foolish or silly that is said in order to amuse someone.
Ecstatic.
One of the only resources I was able to find online when I was researching this film was from the Lewis Carroll Society of North America. I knew it. You did this on purpose, you rat bastards. You knew that 31 Days of Alice in Wonderland adaptations just wasn't enough to make me completely crack. So you made me review this movie to help finish the job. Oh, this movie's gonna be the end of me. Okay, so from what little information I could gather, the 1970 version was a made-for-TV movie that aired on French television and made extensive use of then uncommon blue screen compositing technology. I did manage to get my hands on a behind-the-scenes documentary, but it's entirely in French with no subtitles. Great. So I guess I'll just have to assess the film as is. So the first and most obvious thing about this version is how there aren't any practical sets whatsoever. Everything is shot against a blue screen. Nowadays, it's common for movies and TV shows to shoot in almost entirely virtual environments, from George Lucas to James Cameron and all the way up to the current MCU. But I can't think of anything from 1970 that used early compositing technology this extensively, and certainly not on television. Kudos to director Jean-Christophe Averty for being such a pioneer. That being said, though, yeah, I'm from the old school camp that says that shooting on a physical set is generally a better idea. Compositing tends to age poorly no matter how good it is at the time, and we've seen adaptation after adaptation that managed to create dazzling depictions of Wonderland without needing any compositing effects at all. What this creative choice ends up doing is two things. On the one hand, it manages to create a version of Wonderland in which anything can happen, and visually abstract concepts can be realized more fully than they otherwise could have been at the time. On the other hand, not 1 second of the running time makes you feel fully enmeshed in the world that the film is trying to create. You're always aware you're watching something that was shot in a studio, which it was. Looking at them today, these effects look like something you'd find in the Cheshire Cat's litter box. They are actually about on par with the garbage effects that we saw in the 1986 BBC version that came out 16 years later. So that's even more points that we have to deduct from that version. Another artistic choice that mostly works against the film is the surreality of the backgrounds. Despite them looking extremely fake, most of them look like early 70s Sesame Street, which is cool in a retro sort of way, but some of these backgrounds are almost unwatchable, like this one in the caucus race scene.
Meilleure façon d'expliquer ce qui nous pousse à la c'est la D'abord, il faut tracer un pictographie en forme de cercle.
Are your eyes bleeding yet? Like I said before, the great strength of shooting the film this way is that Wonderland can be as fantastical and bizarre as you could possibly want. And yet, that's where this film really suffers. Instead of fooling the eyes of the viewers, or at the very least intriguing them, the visuals of the movie fluctuate between taking you out of the immersion, giving you a splitting headache, or scaring the bejesus out of you. Just as soon as you think you've settled into another comfortably boring section, some horrific Crayola nightmare rears its ugly head. Get away from that. Another major distraction of the blue screen compositing is how often the characters, especially Alice, will address their dialogue directly to the camera. And they do this a lot, not breaking eye contact with the audience where it would otherwise make sense to. I mean, seriously, who would want to just sit and watch someone yelling at a camera the entire time? Nobody, that's who. Now, I haven't really discussed the actual adaptation of the story of Alice in Wonderland yet. Well, it's pretty standard in that department. On the page, nothing particularly stands out and no major story beats are missing. It's very run-of-the-mill, but serviceable. It's ironic that the most psychedelic brain aneurysm-inducing adaptation of them all would be based on a script that's fairly rote and mundane. It'll please the Lewis Carroll purists out there, but it makes the experience extremely boring to sit through. That is, when it isn't trying to kill you from eye strain or from, stop doing that! I can't make a completely fair judgment on the acting since it is hard to do when you don't speak the language, but from what I can tell, the performances from the actors are either overly broad or overly flat. Alice is played in this version by Marie-Veronique Maureen. She is very ill-tempered in this version. She's less polite and less willing to take all the craziness being thrown at her than other Alices we've seen. That's different, at least.
J'ai déjà vu des chats qui ne souriaient pas, mais des sourires de chat sans chat, ça jamais.
One funny moment I observed was when Alice interacts with the mouse in the pool of tears. In the book, Alice speaks French to the mouse because she assumes the mouse doesn't understand English. But because this is a French language film, they had her ask the mouse a question in English instead. That's kind of clever.
Where is my cat?
Overall, there's really not much worth salvaging from the 1970 version. While not an unfaithful adaptation, it's one of the hardest to sit through, if not the hardest.
It's so dense. Every single image has so many things going on.
No joke. It took me about a week to get through this movie because I was suffering from both severe boredom and eye strain while trying to watch it. It's nothing if not ambitious and experimental, which Alice in Wonderland is at the end of the day, but I would think that an adaptation that's this headache-inducing would make both kids and adults stay away from the source material rather than embracing it. And isn't that counterintuitive to what an adaptation is supposed to do? And as an experience in and of itself, it's dull. It's painful to watch. And it's freaky, man. Well, folks, there you have it. The 1970 French version of Alice in Wonderland. This is it. This is the one that finally broke me. I'm losing my sight. I'm losing my mind. Wish somebody would tell me I'm fine.
C'est tout ça dans le texte. Et puis la traduction est comme ça, hein?
So there you go.
Thank you so much for making that very special episode for us. I will say, I like how angry the girl is. I mean, everyone's going to make have their own opinion as we watch this. Yeah, just the Tenniel illustrations, Alice is so, she doesn't smile once, does she? Right. So I feel like it's kind of,
yeah, it's Tenniel Alice does not smile once, and Tenniel Alice actually looks, to me, she looks more like Lewis Carroll himself than she does like Alice Little, in the face anyway.
that's an interesting take. I've never heard that.
Well, it kind of reminds me of like the Mona Lisa kind of looks like Leonardo da Vinci allegedly. But yeah, that was my take on tonight's movie. We'll see if anybody agrees out there in video land.
Yeah, definitely, like, seriously, if you do have problems with strobe effects, I mean, you might want to skip the whole thing, but I would say definitely just wait till after the caucus race, which I believe is about 22 minutes in. The caucus race and really the opening credits, I felt like were the most extreme. Like, you just kind of feel a little dizzy watching it.
Oh, for sure. Like it definitely, I mean, I think that the picture I used, I was like, I think this is appropriate.
Yes, absolutely.
That's how I felt by the time I was done with it.
And I'm curious, obviously you post the videos one a day for a month. How long does it take you to prepare them? I mean, is it months?
So that was months in the, well, not this one.
Right.
This one wasn't, but the series as a whole, it was months in the making. Which I didn't really cover the making of the series, but because it's about the adaptations themselves. But yeah, the actual making of the series, months in the making, because I had to reread both books. I had to study about Lewis Carroll's life, about the history of each adaptation, and try to come up with original takes on how they all fit together. Not just a review in and of themselves, but like, how do they all fit together? What else was going on in the world at the time? Because when you watch the series, you get not just the adaptations themselves, but you get history of cinema, you get history of the world, you get literary history and criticisms and stuff like that. You get comedy, obviously. But it's just I had a professor in college who said, he was from England. He was like, literature does not exist in a vacuum. It is, and that stuck with me all these years later, basically, that, the story of literature, the story of film and adaptation, that is the story of us, of history. And so tying them all together with what was going on in the world at the time and how this public domain story, well, it didn't start off that way, but it became a public domain story, how it evolved through these different times and places and how it kind of took the shape of its container. But yeah, it took months to prepare. It was a lot of work to get all the footage. And I had a friend who helped me with that. But it wasn't just me sitting in front of the camera, although that happened a lot. But I had to get the props. I had to get, I had to get my White Rabbit, who's got his Flava Flav clock, around his neck there. So it was a work of filmmaking as well as a work of criticism or reviewing. And actually, the Cheshire Cat here is actually the villain of the piece, if you've watched the whole thing. So it's meant to be its own little story in addition to an analysis of these stories. And the one that I didn't get to in the presentation that is the final video of the original lineup was when I talked about this book here, which was a lost episode of the 90s Adventures in Wonderland series. And it's a lost episode because O.J. Simpson is the star. They filmed it. It's never aired, but they released a book version of it before the episode would have aired because of the murders and everything. But I found a copy of the book and I read it out loud for the viewing public. So that was a particularly amusing one.
I enjoyed that episode very, very much because I had never heard of that. And I think a lot of people haven't. So amazing. Yeah, so they filmed it. Then OJ murdered 2 people, and then that's when they put it on the shelf, right? Oh my goodness.
Well, and the funny part is that, again, like when it was filmed, it's like that nobody would have batted an eyelash because he would have been like Regis Philbin or something like that.
Right.
Someone that was so like, how could you not, choose him for your kid show, and then of course nowadays the shoe is very much on the other foot, but here's another part I didn't get to in the episode that I made about it because I didn't find out about it until later. This is like my worlds are coming together because when I read OJ's his own book, If I Did It, he actually mentions at one point that he felt like running fast to stay in one place, like in Through the Looking Glass. He mentions that incident specifically, and I was like, my mind is blown, because I did not expect it to come full circle like that, but yes, indeed it did.
Yeah, we'll have to have him on as a guest sometime. I kid.
You could probably get him relatively.
I bet you
easy.
could. Yeah, I don't think it would be very difficult. And in answer to your question, I know, or your question from like 10 minutes ago, you went really long, by the way, but you're the last speaker. So hey,
I
do
know.
what you want.
I was trying to go fast. I really was.
But there are at least 2 Alice movies in development. One's already been shot. It stars Ella Travolta, John's daughter, and it was shot in Prague. I have no idea when it's supposed to be released. I follow them on Instagram, so I saw all the beautiful pictures from shooting, but I have no idea when it's supposed to be released. And then Netflix, I feel like for years has been talking about kind of rock and roll musical version starring Sabrina Carpenter. But yeah, again, have no idea when those are actually being released. So thank you so much for being our featured Part 3 LCS&A After Dark. I mean, you were the only person who mentioned furries and rat bastards. I think we lived up to our After Dark moniker. Thank you so much. And also thank you to the Curious Archive, because that is the version we are going to watch on YouTube, the 1970 movie. And again, oh, and you know what? Ricardo did have a question for you. I don't know how much of like he does say, it might not be in your realm, but who are, in your opinion, the better Alice illustrators? Do you have any?
That's a good question. I mean, I'd have to look at them all because
there's so many. Yeah.
Well, what you find these days is because the John Tenniel illustrations, those in and of themselves are public domain, so those can be turned around into anything. You see those on T-shirts all the time, on stationery, on everything, because people can. So those are the ones that are immediately recognizable. I'd have to get a list of the, all the different ones that are out there so I could adequately compare. But I mean, those ones accompanied the books, and so inevitably they form a picture in your mind, whether you want them to or not. And I'm not counting like, My Little Golden Book of the Disney version. I'm not counting that. Yeah, I'd have to get a list of them to adequately answer the question. My brain immediately wants to go to the, Tenniel illustrations, just because it's just like those original illustrations of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Like those are iconic in and of themselves. Obviously, there's been 10 billion artistic renderings of those characters too. But
yeah, Arnold Hirschon for years has been working on cataloging all the different versions, and I mean, it seems almost impossible. I mean, just all the different languages, all the different versions. It's just so much, all the different illustrators.
Well,
all right.
I see someone answered my question. I'm really pleased. The 1949 one, the video cover was from the comic book New Adventures in Wonderland number 10, The Lost Ragdoll. Okay, good. Well,
but why put it on the movie, right?
Yeah, then and it doesn't solve the connotations of the thing, I'm afraid. But
Yeah,
it just, I'm glad we got an answer though.
Yes, yeah, I am too. Yeah, I'm surprised you saw that. That was so much earlier in the chat.
I know. I was trying to catch up with, because I was like, I know I have only a half hour and I'm trying to get through this if I can.
All right. Well, thank you so much again. And everyone, it's just going to take me a minute to tee up the film here. And this is it. This is the conclusion, the exciting conclusion, maybe even stunning conclusion of Light's camera Carol. Thank you all for joining us today. And I'm so excited that we have over 50 people for this evening experiment. We don't usually go this late. So thank you all for sticking around, and stay tuned for the 1970 French Alice in Wonderland.